I'm Alexander Hefner, your host on The Open Mind. Twitter and tear gas. Indeed, social media and new technology have transformed society and unloaded ammunition of chaos. That compelling image is the title of my guest's new book by Yale University Press, Twitter and Tear Gas, The Power and Fragility of Network Protests. A penetrating analyst of the interaction between technology and society, Zeynep Tufekci of the University of North Carolina School of Information is a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times. A native of Istanbul, Turkey, turned American scholar, Tufekci argues the Internet's grassroots capacity is easy to mobilize, but hard to win. Having witnessed firsthand a cycle of digitally catalyzed political protest, resistance, even rebellion, she'll assess with us today their effectiveness and viability in the future. And I urge you to read her Twitter and Tear Gas, as well as New York Times columns this year. Mark Zuckerberg is in denial. The world is getting hacked. What do we do to stop it? WikiLeaks isn't whistleblowing. The election won't be rigged, but it could be hacked. All essential reading. And I want to congratulate you on this book, Zeynep. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
For our viewers who are not as familiar with the digital age, what is network protest?
So in the past, if you wanted to get the word out about a protest, you'd usually have to either organize person by person, using leaflets or phones. And very often you needed to try to find a way to get on mass media, get on television. Whereas right now, you can use these digital technologies. You can use Facebook groups. You can use Twitter hashtags to get the word out. You can use Google spreadsheets to organize all the logistics that you're doing. You can use your phone to live stream from a protest. I mean, even if no TV cameras are there, you can have viewership that rivals CNN just from your phone in your pocket. You can communicate in real time. So it's really changed how social movements operate by giving them a whole host of new capabilities that used to be either very expensive or very difficult or just didn't exist. We have, connected supercomputers in our pocket. It's a different world.
One example that you've talked about since the book was published of organic protest that yielded a political outcome was the protest of President Trump's executive orders.
Yes.
And the formation of that contingent at airports across the country. You've mentioned that there's great promise in networks, but without an organizational structure.
Infrastructure, yeah.
So how did that model manifest itself, and how is that the outlier from what your book says in taking it to the next step?
So let me put it this way. My book's title is The Strength and Fragility for a Reason. The power and fragility of these network protests come at the same time. So there's, for example, let's look at the airport protest, or let's look at the Women's March. I think that's one that people have seen a lot. It went from Facebook posts to, a million people in the streets in maybe DC, and also millions of people around the country in just 3 months, right? It went from idea to execution very quickly. And social media was part of how it could scale up so fast. Now compare that to, say, a protest in 1963, a similar March on Washington that people know about because Dr. King's famous speech, I Have a Dream. That protest took maybe 10 years. The movement took 10 years just to get to the place where they could hold the protest with all the logistics it required. I mean, back then it wasn't really easy to get hundreds of thousands of people to DC, and they had to get them out the same day, because back then you couldn't really guarantee the safety of people marching against racism in DC and stay overnight. So they had to get them in, get them out, do all those things. So protests like that in the past was an expression of years and years of capacity building and infrastructure building. You couldn't even think about doing it before having done that. Whereas something like Women's March, it's more like a question mark, because you no longer have to spend 10 years just to get to the point. You can have 3 months and boom, you can scale up very fast. So on the one hand, scaling up that fast really empowers movements, because before you couldn't do it. On the other hand, it's a little bit like a car that's going from 0 to 100 miles in just 10 minutes, and you're building the car along the way. And all of a sudden, you're 100 miles speeding and you haven't built your steering wheel, right? When you scale up that fast without infrastructure, how do you build, say, collective decision-making capacity? How do you decide what's next? How does the movement weather? You don't have that deep experience that allows movements to take step 3, step 4, step 5. So that's why it's power and fragility in the title. You have something that really helps step 1 and step 2. You got springs in your feet, you're jumping really high. But you're underprepared for step 2 and step 3. You're kind of in the limelight a little before you would have been ready in the past. So while movements look the same like the past, they don't really express the same power with their repertoire of action.
To stick with your analogy of a driverless, autonomous vehicle that might not know where it's going. In the case of the ACLU suit, there was a political goal. I think you point out quite importantly that in the Women's March and other instances, there is not that political infrastructure with directions and an exit in mind.
Well, it's both strength and weakness at the same time. Today's movements tend to be more leaderless. They tend to be very participatory, especially the ones on the left, liberal side of the political spectrum. And on the one hand, I mean, people join movements because they want to have a voice, right? They don't want to be cogs in the machine. So that participatory character they have that allows so many people to find a place in them empowers them. On the other hand, once again, what we see is because you scaled up so fast using digital technology, you don't have a way to decide what's the next tactical turn. And very often these protests are holding, a lot of their discussions, say, on Facebook. And let me put it this way. Facebook's business model is to keep you on the site as long as possible. Now, when you're in a meeting, like what is the first thing you think in a meeting? You want the meeting to end, right? You want it to be over. You want it to conclude. But movements today are often holding their meetings in a platform that's designed to make sure nothing concludes because they want to keep you there. So you've got this situation where there's no way to decide what's next. So I saw this in a lot of other countries I studied. So the book came out before, the Women's March. What you saw is that the movements, because they scale up so fast without decision-making capacity and infrastructure for it, they tend to try to repeat the very last thing they did. It's kind of this tactical freeze. Instead of saying, all right, what's next? And what's the correct way to pressure? And what's the next steps? There's a lot of this inability to make a decision collectively because you're not ready for it and you haven't built the infrastructure, means that they keep repeating themselves. They hold another march and another march and another march. That's because they're frozen tactically. Whereas if you look at successful movements in the past, like the civil rights movement, it went through tactic after tactic. You did sit-ins and, first bus boycotts, and you have sit-ins and you have lunch counters. You have the March on Washington. You have all these things, and each one of them is designed to put pressure on whatever you're trying to pressure. Now, I don't want to sort of sound like I think the civil rights movement was this very neat, unmessy thing. It was very complex. It was very messy. The thing is, they had years and years and years of dealing with that tension and mess and the complexity that all movements encompass. Whereas right now, because you got these springs in your feet, you can just jump up so high, and all of a sudden you're like, okay, what's next? And there is no mechanism to get you to that next point. And I see this today in the so-called, resistance, as they often call themselves. There's a lot of energy. There's an enormous amount of grassroots energy, and there's a lot of people doing stuff, but it's not always clear what's the coherent next tactical best move that could bring together all this energy and most productively direct it.
Amen. I have to say that one of the reasons I love your New York Times column is because you identify, I think, realities of the technological space from that sociological perspective that the folks who are stakeholders are unwilling to recognize. For instance, Google and Facebook invite their shareholders to determine if they should take a strong position on fake news. This was just in the news.
Right.
And the answer was no.
Right.
There was no acknowledgement from the corporate hierarchy or their stakeholders that this is something they ought to invest time and energy in thinking about. And so you're an expert at once on the new technology and authoritarianism. So I was hoping that you could reflect on the American veering towards a despotic state and reflect on how the Turkish experience informs what you see in the U.S. now.
I would say that my experience of studying this isn't just, my home country, Turkey, because I also studied the Middle East and Europe, and I think there's a global wave towards, sort of states where there's a strong man. It's almost always a man, but in France we saw it could be a strong woman too, that promises sort of safety among global turmoil, and that seems to be attractive. So what's going on? Part of what's going on here. Let's talk about the U.S. experience because that's, I think, let's talk about the U.S. experience because that's easier to understand. One of the things that a social movement for positive change has to do is convince people to do something, right? You're trying to affirmatively convince people. Whereas an authoritarian government or an authoritarian movement only has to paralyze people and confuse people to stop them from acting. So this is where fake news and misinformation online comes into play. Currently, the business model of Facebook is to keep you there as long as possible. Google, keep you there as long as possible because they're ad-driven. They're selling your eyeballs to advertisers. So that means that they only want to engage you. They put some controls finally after all the brouhaha, but this has been going on for years, and they had been warned about this for years. When you have this kind of misinformation that can just go viral online because the country is already polarized, as it is in the United States, what it created, I think, it's not just the fake news, it's also the misinformation, it's also the echo chambers. What it created is a situation where a lot of people got so many conflicting pieces of information and so many claims and so many things that people feel disempowered and they disengage from politics. And the more people disengage from politics and the more they're just sort of like, I can't make heads or tails out of this because there's so many competing claims, and you have weakening journalism because all the ad money is going to Facebook and Google, so you have local news that's decimated. It's harder for people to have credible sources to figure out what's exactly going on. And when people politically disengage, that's easier for authoritarianism and authoritarians to come into that space with misinformation, with scapegoating, with claims that don't actually hold water if you had in-depth examination of them, but are just proliferating. So when I grew up in Turkey, I grew up under censorship because it was the post-1980 military coup. I was a child and there was heavy censorship. And when the internet first came, I thought, you know what, censorship's not going to work. We'll always be able to somehow route around it and connect to it. And I was hopeful about that. What I hadn't anticipated is that information glut and misinformation works as a form of censorship. If you can't block people from accessing the information, you can flood them with so much misinformation that they can't make sense of the information. You can paralyze people from political action by confusing them, by distorting the reality and creating all this fake news and misinformation. It's almost better than censorship by blocking information because the information is actually there, but can you find it? In this glut, you can't find it. So that, I think, and that's sort of the last, it's the penultimate chapter in my book, is that authoritarians and governments have figured out how to use misinformation and fake news and all the other things that we've seen in the US too, but we see it at a lot of places around the world, to create a public sphere that's not healthy and that is not really very compatible with a healthy liberal democracy.
There is that symbiotic, if not parasitic,